it's way more difficult if you're a politician to try to explain long-term investments in communities as fighting crime. Investing in schools and jobs and infrastructure is actually great for fighting crime because that's not going to be a payoff that you're going to see right away. Those are investments you see over time. Whereas if the public is watching the news that night and they see some violent crime, the politician who gets out there and says, I'm going to be tough on that, I'm going to raise the sentences for X, I'm going to hire more police, that's appealing to some people. And so I think as long as that dynamic is true, we're going to see politicians who take advantage of it.
I'm Slava Tilba. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today I'm talking to Professor Rachel Barkow, Vice Dean and Segal Family Professor of Regulatory Law and Policy, Faculty Director at the Center on the Administration of Criminal Law. You were a member of the United States Sentencing Commission and have been a member of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office Conviction Integrity Policy Advisory Board. And you are the author of the book Prisoners of Politics, Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration. Could you please explain the title of your book?
Thanks for having me and for asking the question. So the title of the book is about how we have become a country that incarcerates a huge chunk of the world's population. And it's really that there's political dynamics in the United States. So the idea of prisoners of politics is a double meaning, that both the people that we actually have in prison are there because of our political system. And unfortunately, all of us, whether we're incarcerated or not, are trapped in this political system. And it's very hard to undo it in order to get out of a cycle that leads to so many people being incarcerated.
And why do you call it a cycle?
I think it's a dynamic that involves high-profile crimes get committed and they get media attention, and the people who watch the news or read social media, you really only hear about cases that are awful, horrible things that happen. And it provokes in the public a response that makes them supportive of policies that they think will stop some horrible thing like that from happening again. And it makes them prone to support really kind of harsh outcomes, even though they don't work. And so we have so many instances where you'll have a high profile event, the public will be outraged, politicians will propose some kind of harsh response, getting rid of parole, increasing sentence lengths, what have you. And then that then in turn leads to many people getting incarcerated, serving longer sentences. And when they get out, it's that much harder for them to successfully re-enter, because the longer you serve, the harder it is. They have all these collateral consequences that are also passed in response to that anger. That makes it hard for people to get jobs, driver's licenses, housing, and it creates this cycle that leads people to then commit additional crimes because they're really set up to fail, not to succeed. And so it's a question of how do you break that cycle where we're actually making things worse instead of better.
Do you see a way to shape the media coverage to advance these reform efforts you and your colleagues are working on?
That's a tough one. I think we are seeing some shifts in specialized media outlets, organizations like The Appeal and the Marshall Project, which really show all the things that are wrong with criminal justice in America, but they're kind of niche outlets. And if you just rely on your local news or newspapers, you pretty much still see the same coverage, because it's not an interesting news story to run a story about how ineffective a particular crime fighting strategy is. Whereas, an instance of violence, that's a narrative. It grabs people. It leads the evening news for local broadcasts every night. And that's true pretty much everywhere in whatever crime rates are, because you only need the one story. So I think it's really hard to get out of that rut and to break that kind of coverage. I think the best that could be done is to also have coverage of the things that happen in prisons, how hard it is for people to re-enter, more stories about the people who've been affected by mass incarceration. I think that can help, just like the stories in response to some of the protests about racialized violence against certain communities by the police. I think that really start to put a face on things that many people had experienced, but others had not witnessed. And as we saw with the killing of George Floyd and many other examples where we have now video footage of police violence against people, that has kind of shifted the narrative. I think that's what it's going to take. I think it's going to be more coverage of things that many people hadn't yet seen for them to realize there's another side to this, a really ugly side, a really vicious and violent side by the state. And it's really harmful for people's lives. And then, maybe that opens them up to the idea that it's also ineffective and it's not making them safer, that sort of thing. So I think that's going to be the key to the shift.
Is this cycle continuing because of fear, because of this media coverage and with politicians? Or do you see a concerted effort, ulterior motives? For example, according to Baum's 2016 Harper's magazine article, Legalize It All, How to Win the War on Drugs, John Ehrlichman of the Nixon administration told him the war on drugs was about going after hippies and black people. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I think there's definitely opportunistic politicians who know the public is fearful, who know that there is a large segment of the public that has either implicit or explicit biases against people of color. And I think they play on that. They play on those fears and those prejudices. And by putting themselves out there as people that are going to get tough on communities that, some segment of the public fear, I think they think there's votes to be had. And, they're not wrong, unfortunately. We have seen elections that are won with tough on crime political platforms. So I do think some of it is opportunistic efforts by politicians to get votes. I think the drug war, the quote that you had about kind of, hippies or liberals or radicals, whatever group, today they might be labeled with, the far left progressives, whatever it is that is the target. I think the idea is to try to portray your political opponents in some way as an enemy or as a cause for concern to try to get more votes, to rally your base, to get political support. And I do think we see that. I think it gets lost because there's so much discussion these days about how there's a bipartisan movement to address some of the excesses of criminal law in America and punishment. And there has been some bipartisan effort to reduce some sentences, but people forget there's also bipartisan opposition. And so you see both the Democratic and Republican parties, members of both, who play on this fear card, and they do it to try to get votes, because it's way more difficult if you're a politician to try to explain long-term investments in communities as fighting crime. Investing in schools and jobs and infrastructure is actually great for fighting crime, because that's not going to be a payoff that you're going to see right away. Those are investments you see over time. Whereas if the public is watching the news that night and they see some violent crime, the politician who gets out there and says, I'm going to be tough on that, I'm going to raise the sentences for X, I'm going to hire more police, that's appealing to some people. And so I think as long as that dynamic is true, we're going to see politicians who take advantage of it.
You speak about the need for institutional changes in several of your presentations on the book. And you address how relatively few judges have previously worked as defense lawyers. Could you explain why it is important and how it could be changed in a meaningful way?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of institutional dynamics that bring about mass incarceration. We've talked about these political dynamics. And so the question is, what puts the brakes on a political environment where you get the majority all riled up to support really harsh sentences, or to support coercive plea practices by prosecutors, or to, give immunity to police to just kind of do whatever they want and not face any consequences? And we have a break for that in the Constitution. We have all kinds of protections that the framers put in there because they anticipated that there would be excess criminal laws. It was one of their chief concerns. You see it all over the founding era debates. So the tools are in the Constitution. And one question is, why haven't judges done a better job to enforce those and protect the rights of individuals against government overreach? And so the tools are there. So why haven't judges used them? You know, I think there's a number of reasons, but I do think one that is worthy of attention is, who are our federal judges? You know, how do you become a federal judge? What does that profile look like? And as your question points out, we have an enormous number of federal judges who worked for the government. That's how they got their position. You know, they were connected enough to get nominated and confirmed. And while that government experience is terrific, and I think it's great to have judges who have that, you don't want such an imbalance on the bench that that's the entirety of what your federal bench looks like. But we are really at a point where that's basically the case. There's a really good report by Cato where they looked at the professional backgrounds of federal judges, and they found that for every one judge who has public defense experience, criminal defense experience, there are 7 who were prosecutors or government side lawyers. So, you know, it's a 7-to-1 imbalance. More than 40% of all federal judges were criminal prosecutors. So you're talking about a bench that is made up of people who spent their professional lives bringing cases, being part of this enterprise that puts people in prisons. And I think it's just asking a lot of people to put a line between that past experience and really dig deep and investigate it. I think there's just some implicit biases that come with that. And maybe not even biases, maybe it's just an outlook and experiential set of values and moments that have an impact on how they approach cases. And it's what's missing. So we're missing the people who their professional lives were spent representing individuals. You know, and if you represent an individual, you really see how some of these government abuses affect people. You really see how difficult it is for people to re-enter after they've served a prison term. You know, it's a whole setup where it's basically set up for people to fail. You can't make your appointments on supervision because it's very hard to do that and get money for transportation and to get childcare to get there. There's so many, it's onerous. You lose jobs you have because you have so many check-ins. You know, there's this whole kind of network of experiences that people who represent actual clients know about. And they see it firsthand. They see the misery in communities and in families. And I just think we need more people on the bench who bring that kind of experience. I think it just will affect how they decide cases. I think, you know, we want all of our judges to be objective and decide things on the basis of the law. But, you know, I don't think anyone is naive enough to think that one's experience in life shapes how that is viewed when there's ambiguity, when there's a question of judgment involved. And so I think it's really important that we diversify professionally who becomes a federal judge.
Do you see a mechanism to do that? You have pointed out that the change under President Obama was relatively small.
Yeah, I think, you know, he did kind of make a modest effort, but as you say, the numbers only ticked up a little bit. I think the key is it's going to take political pressure. You know, I mean, that's the irony of all this. You know, I can't make any institutional suggestion that doesn't depend on political will. And so it's a question of taking whatever political capital you have as a criminal justice reform movement and figuring out what you want to ask of the government. Because there is this movement of people who care deeply about reforming criminal justice in America, who want to reform policing and punishment and do away with mass incarceration. And, you know, the key is how to mobilize those people and get them to ask for the things that will really lead to those results. And so part of it is just getting folks to pay attention. I think more people are. I have seen more attention paid to the professional backgrounds of federal judges. And I do think there's going to be some pressure put on President Biden to really focus on that. You know, we'll see. We'll see if it's successful or not. But I do think many of us have been raising this and have asked for that to be a priority. And I think as soon as he pays attention to it, it's going to be obvious that it's important for his agenda to do that, because he's made a commitment to reform criminal justice practices. He's made a commitment to the African American community that he has their back. And, you know, one way you fulfill those kinds of commitments is to make sure that you pay attention to the federal bench so that those people are protecting the constitutional rights of minority interests the way the framers intended. And I think, as soon as it's pointed out to him what the federal bench currently looks like in terms of that prosecutor domination, I think the solution speaks for itself, and the need to get more people who are civil liberties lawyers and defense lawyers on there. And I hope that he does it.
What do you think about the imbalance between the budgets of the prosecutors' offices and of the public defenders? Can that be changed?
Yeah, so, money is a big issue when it comes to criminal law reform. And public defenders' offices are starved for resources. It's a real crisis, and it's absolutely necessary to get them more funding. The prosecutors' offices often don't have great funding either, to be honest, but what they have is the leverage to induce people to plead guilty. You don't need as big of a budget if you have other levers of authority that allow you to quickly dispose of cases. And for the prosecutor's office, they can put people in jail pre-trial. And if you are in jail pre-trial, you will plead to get out. You will. It's just an enormous lever of power that prosecutors have. So they use that to get guilty pleas, so they don't need to expend resources to go to trial. They use mandatory minimum sentencing and the threat of bringing charges with mandatory minimums to get people to plead guilty. And all of that, even if they don't have the budgetary resources, those things enable them to put real pressure on defendants without them having to expend resources to go to trial. So, I think the way to deal with budget issues is, one, leveling the playing field in terms of those negotiations. So, at a minimum, making sure that defense lawyers have access to all that's in the prosecutor's file so they can make good judgments about whether it is a good case to take to trial. I think it's important to reduce the kinds of things prosecutors can threaten if someone goes to trial, because that at least will level the playing field so those budgetary differences won't be quite as pronounced in terms of practical effects. The other thing I think is really important is, if you're a local prosecutor's office and you bring charges against somebody and it's got a long prison term attached to it, you don't pay for that as a prosecutor. You are part of a local budget, typically a county budget. And when people go to prison, which is the case for basically every felony in most states, that's paid for out of the state budget. So prosecutors are basically using a free state resource. And, anything that's free is overused, right? Anyone who's ever been to a complimentary buffet knows that, if you don't pay for it, you'll try everything. You don't really think about things in the same way when you're not spending the money. And I think that's another key institutional fix that we should be pursuing, which is to get prosecutors to internalize those costs, either by taking some of it out of their budget directly, or creating other financial incentives for them to really understand using state prisons it's not free. It's not free for the polity. It comes out of tax dollars. And we have seen studies where, I just read one where, for example, when people who commit crimes as young people, as juveniles, previously, when they were sent to state facilities, the number of charges brought were much greater than when that shifted back to local counties. As soon as counties had to pay for it, all of a sudden they realized, well, do we really need to be pursuing these long sentences? Same thing in California. California, after the Supreme Court said their prisons were overcrowded, engaged in this process of realignment and basically took people out of the state prison and told the counties, you need to figure out what to do with them. And, lo and behold, once the counties were financially responsible, they didn't automatically assume that incarceration was the answer anymore. They realized that there were other ways to address these folks that didn't involve paying for putting them in cages. So I think having local communities bear the costs of their prosecution decisions could be an enormous help, even if we can't increase defender office budgets, although I hope we do that too.